and they built a power plant on my lake, on my father's land, without permission, without shame, and without knowing what I was capable of. The HOA called it progress. They called it community property. But I called it what it was: theft. I warned them. I filed the paperwork. I showed them the deeds. They laughed. So at midnight, I walked to the edge of the water, turned the crank my father left behind, and drained the lake beneath their $1 million project. By sunrise, their power grid was dead, and justice finally came with the sound of water disappearing into the earth. The lake has always been mine. Not in some poetic fleeting sense, no. This lake was carved from the earth, shaped, and filled by my father James Harlan's own hands nearly 50 years ago. He dredged the basin with stubborn precision, lined the bed with clay and stone, stocked it with bass and bluegill, and then passed it down to me, Jake Harlan, the way other fathers hand over war medals or heirloom watches. It was ours, legally irrevocably etched into deeds and plats since 1976. Yet somehow, that ironclad truth didn't stop the West Bend Homeowners Association from planting their fluorescent pink survey flags around its edges like modern-day conquistadors, claiming land they had no right to touch. I first spotted those intrusive markers on a crisp, early spring morning. I was walking Baron Murphy, my 2 half-Labrador, half-Mayhem mutts, along the western shoreline when the little flags caught my eye, fluttering in the breeze, like accusations. They weren't placed randomly. They curved in a deliberate arc that cut halfway across what I knew to be my property line. No one had asked permission. No one had knocked on my door. No surveyor had waved a courteous hello. I stopped dead in my tracks, boots sinking slightly into the damp earth, and felt a cold knot form in my gut. At first, I told myself it was a mistake, perhaps a utility check, an erosion survey, or some routine environmental study. The HOA had pulled minor stunts like that before, especially since Carla Whitmore, the new board president, had taken the helm. She carried herself like a general overseeing a military campaign rather than a suburban neighborhood of tidy lawns and identical mailboxes. Still, mistakes happen. I snapped a dozen clear photos with my phone, emailed them to the HOA board that same afternoon, and copied the city clerk for good measure. The reply came the next morning, terse and evasive. We are working on an infrastructure improvement project for the benefit of the community. Details will be shared in the next board meeting. No explanation, no mention of permits, no acknowledgement that they were marking land that had never belonged to them. I'll be honest, I rarely attended HOA meetings. After retiring from the Army Corps of Engineers, I'd sworn off bureaucratic pageantry for good. But this felt different. This felt personal. The meeting was held in the high school gymnasium rows of folding chairs arranged like a courtroom. By the time I arrived, the place was already packed. The board sat elevated on the stage beneath harsh fluorescent lights, microphones poised, expressions polished and confident. Carla presided at the center navy blazer, crisp, a small silver pin on her lapel, glinting like a badge of authority. When public comments opened, I raised my hand at once. She deliberately called on 3 others before finally nodding in my direction. "Yes, Mr. Harlan," she said, her tone already laced with practiced patience. "I'd like to know what project involves planting survey flags on my private property," I said evenly. "Specifically, on the shoreline of the lake my family has owned for nearly half a century." Carla offered a thin, condescending smile. "Mr. Harlan, the lake forms part of our neighborhood's shared ecosystem. Our environmental consultants have determined it plays a vital role in upcoming power distribution initiatives we've partnered on with GreenSpark Energy." "Power distribution," I repeated, "on my land." She adjusted her notes. "We've entered a contract with GreenSpark to construct a micro-hydro power station. It will supply HOA-owned amenities and provide backup power during grid outages. A forward-thinking, sustainable project that benefits everyone." "You don't own the lake," I countered. "It's on my deed. My father dredged and built it in 1976. It's been private Harlan property ever since." A low murmur rippled through the audience. Carla's smile never wavered. "There appears to be a boundary discrepancy. Our consultants believe a portion of the lake falls within the HOA Greenbelt designation. We're coordinating with city zoning to resolve the matter. I have the original plat map, water use rights, and 50 years of undisputed ownership," I said, my voice rising despite my effort to stay calm. You cannot simply build on private land because you've decided it's convenient. For the briefest moment, irritation flickered across her features. She leaned into the microphone. Thank you for your input, Mr. Harlan. We'll move to the next question. Just like that, dismissed. As I filed out of the gym, I passed a man in a hard hat and high-visibility vest, speaking quietly with another board member. Most of their conversation was lost in the crowd, but one fragment reached me clearly. We can start staging equipment next week if the ground stays dry. That night, sleep evaded me. I lay staring at the ceiling, anger simmering low and steady. They weren't merely overstepping, they were rewriting history, pretending the lake had never truly belonged to us at all. And they had chosen the wrong man to test. Over the next few days, the invasion gathered speed. Trucks rumbled into the common green at dawn, their diesel engines growling like distant thunder. Flatbeds unloaded towering stacks of metal crates, pipes, turbines, concrete forms, all stamped with the bright green logo of Green Spark Energy. Bright yellow signs sprouted along the lake's edge overnight. Future site of West Bend Community Energy Initiative building, a sustainable tomorrow. The words mocked me every time I glanced out my window. No one knocked. No one requested an easement. No one even pretended to seek my consent. One morning, I walked to the flagged boundary with coffee in hand, Bear and Murphy tugging at their leashes. The air carried the sharp tang of fresh-cut lumber and hydraulic fluid. In the distance, metal clanged against metal as workers assembled scaffolding. A family of ducks glided across the water undisturbed, for now their ripples the only movement on an otherwise mirror-still surface. I stood there longer than I intended, feeling the old familiar ache of something sacred being chipped away piece by careless piece. This wasn't about boundary lines anymore. It was about power people who believed they could seize whatever they desired if they dressed it in buzzwords like sustainability and community benefit. They had chosen the wrong lake and the wrong man. A few days later, a glossy HOA newsletter arrived in my mailbox, folded with guilty precision. Page 2 featured a full-color spread on the Power Initiative. They had dubbed it a resident-endorsed leap toward energy independence. The artist's rendering showed a sleek, futuristic generator perched at the southern tip of the lake, My Lake. Though they labeled it only Lake Parcel B, a sterile bureaucratic term that twisted in my stomach like a blade. An announcement followed an emergency planning session. The upcoming Monday to finalize community resource allocations. I circled the date in red. I arrived early, folder thick with evidence. Inside my deed, the 1976 plat map, faded photographs of my father James knee-deep in mud during the original dredging, a notarized 1983 easement affirming my sole rights to the water line, and subsurface structures, even a letter from the county engineer who had signed off on the project decades ago. The HOA conference room felt colder than the night outside, sterile white walls. No windows, fluorescent hum overhead. More attendees than usual filled the seats, many of them strangers in crisp polos embroidered with the Green Spark logo. A lawyer in a charcoal suit sat at the far end, fingers flying across his laptop, while he murmured into a wireless earpiece. Carla stood at the head of the long table, radiating self-assurance, navy blazer immaculate. "Good to see you again, Mr. Harlan," she said without meeting my eyes. I didn't sit. I strode forward and laid my documents down with deliberate care. I'd like these entered into the official minutes, I stated. They prove beyond doubt that the lake, including the parcel you're calling B, is private Harlan property. This project is unlawful trespass. Carla offered a diplomatic smile and glanced toward the lawyer. He barely lifted his gaze. Mr. Harlan, the HOA operates under covenants, ratified by a supermajority of residents. The board retains authority to develop and manage communal utilities for the neighborhood's benefit. This isn't a communal utility, I replied, keeping my voice level. It's a private power station erected on land you do not own. Nothing in the covenants grants you the right to confiscate private property or reclassify it as shared after 50 years. Carla interjected smoothly. We've examined your documents. Regrettably, the language contains ambiguities. There is no explicit exclusion of the water body from community designation. Because it's a privately constructed lake, I said, you don't need an exclusion clause for something you never possessed in the first place. She pressed her palms together as though gathering patience from thin air. We're not here to litigate ownership tonight. The board has already voted. The energy project proceeds. Then you're committing trespass, I warned. And if construction begins on my land, I will pursue an immediate injunction. A ripple of unease passed through the room. Carla's expression hardened, the mask slipping for just a second. Should you choose litigation, she said slowly, you will bear responsibility for delaying an essential community initiative. Costs could be substantial for everyone, including yourself. The HOA reserves the right to recover those expenses. I stared at her. Are you threatening me with financial punishment for defending my own property? Her tone dipped into syrupy concern. We're simply requesting cooperation, Mr. Harlan. This isn't personal, but it was deeply personal. I saw it in the fleeting smirk she exchanged with a lawyer, in the way the GreenSpark representatives flipped through their contracts without sparing me a glance. The decision had been made long before I walked in. This meeting wasn't dialogue, it was theater. I left without shaking a single hand. Outside, the night air was thick and humid. I sat in my truck for a long while, hands clenched around the steering wheel, staring across the rows of porch lights glowing softly in the darkness. Somewhere beyond the tree line lay my lake. My father's legacy now reduced to a bargaining chip in a game I hadn't agreed to play. That week, the heavy machinery arrived in earnest. Dump trucks, concrete mixers, temporary orange fencing, a floating work barge anchored just beyond the intake zone. Volunteers in HOA-branded shirts handed out tote bags emblazoned with West Bend Energy Future, as though a reusable bag could erase complicity in theft. I filed my first formal cease and desist through an old Army buddy turned land use attorney. He reviewed my evidence, grimaced, and dispatched a stern demand letter. Their response arrived swiftly, not compliance, but a counter letter disputing the validity of my water rights and claiming that the community's interest in renewable infrastructure supersedes individual assertions. They even cited a federal precedent that had no bearing on private lakes. It was deliberate obfuscation. They were daring me to escalate, betting I wouldn't. But I knew the law, and I knew the land better than they ever could. Because my father hadn't merely built a lake, he'd engineered a reservoir meant to endure drought and deluge alike. And hidden beneath decades of silt and algae at the deepest point lay a valve, a drain, a controlled spillway tied to an underground culvert that ran half a mile downhill beyond HOA jurisdiction into a protected wetland buffer. A failsafe, a secret exit. I'd helped him install it at 17, grumbling about over-engineering. Now it felt like Providence. They had constructed their fortress atop ground they didn't own, certain I lacked the will to fight. But I wasn't going to battle them in their arenas, meetings, memos, or courtrooms on their schedule. I would fight on mine, and the lake itself would be my ally. The first real construction began on a Thursday, just before dawn. I stepped onto the porch with my coffee steam curling into the chill air when the low rumble of diesel engines rolled across the water like an approaching storm. Through the gray mist clinging to the lake headlights pierced the trees one by one. Trucks lined up along the newly erected temporary fence tires, crunching gravel that had no business being on my shoreline. They didn't wait for permits to be displayed. They didn't wait for court dates. They simply arrived. By 9 o'clock, the floating barge had returned, this time rigged with scaffolding, 2 roaring gas generators bolted to its deck, and a small crane swaying gently in the breeze. Workers in hard hats and reflective vests waded waist-deep into my water, positioning a temporary cofferdam around the planned intake site. The HOA had turned a section of my lake into their private construction yard, a metal island anchored in the heart of Harlan property. I stood on my dock legal folder, clutched in one hand, phone in the other, disbelief burning hotter than anger. I called the sheriff's non-emergency line. The dispatcher's voice was calm, almost apologetic. That sounds like a civil dispute, sir. You'll need to pursue it through your attorney or the courts. My attorney already served a cease and desist. They're actively trespassing. I understand, sir. But unless there's an immediate physical threat, we can't intervene. It's private property versus private property. I hung up, jaw tight. Then I dialed Carla directly. Voicemail, of course. Carla, I said, forcing steadiness into every word, your crews are on my land right now. Heavy equipment is crossing my tree line. Materials are being staged on my shoreline. This is a direct violation. I will escalate. Call me. She never did. By noon, they had poured a concrete foundation pad on the barge, and begun bolting down the turbine housing. I logged every detail from the deck with binoculars, truck license plates, company names, timestamps, even the faces of the foreman shouting orders. Evidence for the inevitable day in court. But courts move slowly and bulldozers do not. That night, the lake glowed under harsh floodlights, white beams slicing through the fog like searchlights over a prison yard. The generators thrummed steadily, a mechanical heartbeat, invading the quiet I had guarded for decades. Around 11, I saw her. Carla. She stood on the edge of the barge platform, in a neon safety vest over her blazer clipboard in hand, gesturing sharply at points along the far shore. She laughed, with the Green Spark representatives, the sound carrying faintly across the water, confident, triumphant. I walked down the hill and shouted across the narrowing gap. Carla, you're trespassing. You're going to regret this. She turned spotlight, catching the satisfied curve of her mouth. She raised one hand in a lazy wave, mocking, dismissive, as if I were a nuisance animal yapping from the wrong side of a fence. Something inside me snapped taut like a rope pulled to its limit. The next morning, I discovered fresh tire tracks cutting across my back lawn, stopping only yards from the deck. Deep treads, heavy vehicle. And beside them, a single set of boot prints, size 11 aggressive lug pattern, leading toward the tree line and back. Someone had driven onto my property in the dark. A message. A warning. I reported it. A deputy came, took photos, asked questions, but his expression said it all, not much we can do. When I mentioned the HOA feud, he sighed. Between you and me, Mr. Harlan, your association plays hardball. They usually get their way. Not this time, I said quietly. He paused at his cruiser door. Just watch your back. These things turn ugly fast. That evening, alone in my father's old study, I spread the yellowed documents across the desk one more time. Boundaries, easements, water rights. Every line memorized. Then my eyes fell on the drainage overlay I hadn't studied in years. A network of subsurface channels engineered to prevent catastrophic overflow in the early days. At the bottom corner in James Harlan's precise handwriting, emergency release valve installed west access only. Use with caution. I traced the route with my fingertip. The main pipe ran directly beneath the new construction zone, feeding a reinforced culvert that exited half a mile downstream outside HOA boundaries into federally protected wetland catchment 43B. A grandfathered structure. Legally registered. Forgotten by everyone except me. I sat back, heart pounding, with something between dread and clarity. The HOA had built their precious power plant directly atop a system they didn't even know existed. A system that could empty the entire lake in hours. Quietly. Legally. Completely. I closed the folder and stared out at the floodlit barge, its lights mocking the darkness. They thought they held all the leverage. They were wrong. The lake still had one card left to play, and it answered only to me. I spent the next 3 days pursuing every official channel I could think of, chasing down proof that should have stopped the madness cold. First stop, the county assessor's office. I waited in a fluorescent-lit lobby that smelled of old paper and copier toner, then handed over my file to a polite but wary clerk. I requested certified overlays showing the HOA greenbelt boundaries superimposed on my plat. She typed for a long minute, brow furrowed. "Those maps are flagged for revision," she said carefully. "I'd need zoning approval to release the updated layers." Flagged by whom? She offered only an apologetic shrug and printed the original 1976 deed instead, another sheet for my growing stack of ignored evidence. Next came the zoning department. 45 minutes in a plastic chair before a tired man named Mark ushered me into his cramped office. He knew why I was there before I opened my mouth. "You're the lake owner," he said, rubbing his temples. "That's right. The HOA is building on it. I've filed notices. Nothing's happening." He leaned back. "I can't discuss active partnerships. They submitted under Section 9B Renewable Community Infrastructure. City policy favors green energy projects, even when they're on private land." "There's a boundary dispute on record," he replied, as if reading from a script. "There is no dispute," I said, voice sharpening. "There's a deed. There's 50 years of unchallenged use. You don't redraw lines to make a grant application prettier." Mark spread his hands. "Look, I'm not the bad guy here. I've got 26 files on my desk and half a staff. Without a court order, the project rolls forward. The wall, impenetrable, built from delays, exhaustion, and momentum. By the time I got home that afternoon, the barge had sprouted a sleek fiberglass control housing HVAC vents, glowing digital panels, bold lettering across the side. West Bend Smart Grid Hub. It looked like something lifted from a tech brochure and dropped into my backyard. Worse, the neighborhood was starting to buy the story. A forwarded screenshot from the HOA Facebook group showed smiling families posing beside construction workers, kids holding miniature turbines. Captions full of hashtags, #powering the future. West Bend, proud. One photo froze my blood, Carla, on my own dock scissors in hand, cutting a ceremonial ribbon while residents applauded. That evening, I met with a second attorney, Arden Colfax, a veteran-recommended litigator who'd fought land battles for ranchers across the West. He spread my documents across his conference table and studied them in silence. "You're right," he said at last. "Legally, morally, historically. But they've maneuvered you into a procedural box. They're moving fast, manufacturing facts on the ground, betting you'll run out of steam before a judge hears the case. I won't. Good. But willpower alone won't stop concrete from setting. We can file for emergency injunctive relief, but their counsel will drag it out. Months, most likely. By then, the plant could be online. And then, they'll argue reliance interest, community dependence. Make it politically painful for any judge to pull the plug. So if I wait, I lose. Slowly, yes." He paused, choosing his next words. "There's another route, environmental. If we prove wetland impacts or runoff violations, we might trigger an immediate administrative stop. We'd need hard data, tests, surveys, or a dramatic demonstration," he said quietly. I nodded, mind already turning. That night, I walked the shoreline alone, boots crunching on fresh gravel the crews had spread. I stopped at the thick stand of reeds masking the concealed western entryway, the heavy concrete hatch my father had poured in 1983. I knelt, brushed away layers of leaf litter and moss, and laid my palm on the cool, rusted metal. The bolts were still solid, the seals intact. Beneath it, the emergency release waited patient, silent, lethal to any structure that depended on constant water depth. This wouldn't be sabotage. It would be restoration. One last time, I tried the proper channels. I filed an emergency complaint with the regional EPA office under the Clean Water Act, unauthorized structures potential wetland discharge violations. I attached drone footage, annotated maps, sworn affidavits from both attorneys. 2 days later came the reply, a single polite paragraph, explaining that a low-impact community renewable project did not meet the threshold for urgent intervention. Carla had won another round. But every dam has its limit, and beneath the surface water still sought its own level. I still held the means to set it free. The signs appeared at dawn as if planted by ghosts in the night. I stepped out for my usual walk with the dogs and froze mid-stride. Bright blue metal plaques on sturdy wooden posts gleamed in the early light, one staked firmly on the western shore, another driven deep into the ground, right beside my own dock. The letters were bold, reflective, impossible to miss. West Bend HOA Community Infrastructure Zone. Unauthorized access prohibited. Trespassers subject to fines and civil penalties under HOA code. I read them twice, 3 times, the words blurring as blood pounded in my ears. That dock, the exact spot where my father used to tie his old aluminum fishing boat, where we scattered his ashes on a quiet autumn morning, was now declared community infrastructure. My land, my memories, rebranded overnight. A neighbor out walking his spaniel slowed and gave me an awkward nod. "Quite something, huh?" he said. "Carla says it'll save us thousands on electric bills once it's running." I couldn't answer. My throat tightened as I stared at the plaque hammered into soil my father had shaped with his own hands. I called Carla, straight to voicemail again. "Take those signs down," I said, voice low and steady, "or I will." By afternoon, a certified letter arrived via courier. Inside, an official notice of violation, addressed to Jake Harlan, signed by the HOA's general counsel. It accused me of threatening to disrupt or remove legally posted signage related to the West Bend Energy Initiative, labeling my words obstruction of a sanctioned infrastructure project. Continued interference, it warned, could trigger fines or municipal code enforcement. They had inverted reality. I was now the trespasser on my own property. The shift rippled through the neighborhood like a slow poison. Casual waves from passersby dried up. Conversations on the street ended abruptly when I approached. I became that guy, the cranky holdout blocking progress, the selfish veteran who couldn't see the bigger picture. HOA emails began arriving with gentle, insidious bulletins. For everyone's safety during the final construction phase, please respect posted signage around the lake area. They were crafting the narrative, paint me as unstable, so that whatever came next would look like the inevitable consequence of my own obstinance. That week, the last major components arrived. The turbine itself, sleek silver monstrous, was lowered onto its mounting by crane. Technicians in green spark coveralls ran final diagnostics, their laptops casting blue glows across the water as they monitored voltage spikes. I overheard one say to another, "We'll be fully live by Monday if the weather cooperates." Sunday morning, I made one final unannounced visit to the HOA office during open hours. Carla sat behind the glass partition, reviewing papers, looking utterly unruffled. "I need 5 minutes," I said through the intercom. She glanced at the wall clock, sighed theatrically, then buzzed me into the side room. Inside, she folded her hands like a patient teacher. "I'm here to end this reasonably," I began. "Remove the signs. Halt construction. The lake is private deeded, recorded, undisputed for 50 years. I have every right to protect it." "You keep repeating that," she replied smoothly. "But our legal review finds the shoreline boundaries ambiguous." "There is no ambiguity," I cut in. "You know it. You're simply counting on the courts taking longer than your construction schedule." She didn't deny it. She simply offered that same practiced smile. "Mr. Harlan, this is emotional for you, I understand." "It's not emotional," I said. "It's theft." Her expression cooled. "This project serves over 400 households. Energy credits, environmental benefits. You're obstructing something far larger than one man's sentiment. Then build it somewhere else." "That isn't an option." Her voice turned to ice. "You don't hold the only rights here." I stood. "You've been warned." And this time I truly meant it. That night, I retrieved the old crank handle from my father's shed at heavy iron leather grip, cracked but solid. I carried it down to the hidden spillway access, cleared decades of debris from the concrete hatch, and tested the bolts. They groaned, but turned. The mechanism beneath was dry stiff, but unbroken. I didn't open it yet. Instead, I hand-delivered one last letter, time-stamped, notarized, slipped under the HOA office door after hours. "What you have until midnight Sunday to remove all equipment and personnel from Harlan property. At 12:01 a.m., Monday, I will no longer be responsible for the condition of the lake." No rage, no threats of violence, just quiet final notice. They never acknowledged it. But I knew Carla read every word, and when the moment came, she would remember the calm certainty in them. Because the lake wasn't theirs to command. It never had been. Sunday I spent almost entirely in the old boathouse. The door protested with a long, rusty groan when I pushed it open, releasing a breath of trapped air thick with the scents of cedar shavings, motor oil, and sun-bleached canvas smells that carried me straight back to boyhood summers. Dust motes drifted in the slanted beams of light that slipped through warped siding. Everything was exactly as my father had left it. Coils of rope, neatly hung tools, lined on pegboard silhouettes, the faint outline of his work boots still pressed into the sawdust floor. This was where James Harlan had taught me to tie a bowline, one-handed to rebuild a carburetor, blindfolded to listen to the lake the way sailors listen to the sea. "Build anything you want, son," he'd say, wiping grease from his fingers, "but build it like it has to outlast you." Today I needed something that would outlast them. I located the trapdoor at the rear, heavy oak planks over concrete steps descending into cool darkness. Halfway down, a steel gate barred debris from clogging the intake channel. A thin ribbon of water still trickled through, following the engineered slope toward the main diverter. Everything was sound, no collapses, no root intrusions, no silt blockages. At the bottom waited the valve itself, a squat, formidable assembly of steel and brass crusted with time but structurally perfect. The crank slot accepted the old iron handle with a satisfying click. Gears meshed cleanly when I tested them. A wall-mounted pressure gauge twitched faintly, proof the system still breathed. Bolted beside it was the brass placard I'd barely noticed as a teenager. Property of James Harlan, 1976. Unauthorized tampering prohibited under EPA runoff control regulations. Diverts to wetland catchment 43B per certification, numbered 1094, That certification was gold. I'd already verified it remained active in municipal records, grandfathered unrevoked, tied directly to federal oversight. My father hadn't just engineered a failsafe, he'd armored it in law. I photographed every detail: serial numbers, seal integrity, flow direction, arrows, the placard itself. Then I emailed the images to Arden Colfax with a single line. Backup plan confirmed. Please verify catchment status. His reply came within hours. It confirmed. Catchment 43B still EPA protected. Controlled release below flow cap is within your rights as landowner. Gray area legally but defensible. Document everything. Gray area was enough. They had forced my hand with every possible weapon: bureaucracy, intimidation, silence, assuming age and patience would keep me in check. But I wasn't some compliant retiree chasing neighborhood approval. I was an engineer who understood leverage, a soldier who knew terrain, a son guarding what was sacred. That night, I prepared with the calm of a man executing a long-planned operation. I oiled the gearbox until the crank turned smoothly, cleared the intake grate of decades of leaves, checked downstream markers to ensure no unexpected obstructions, laid out gloves, flashlight phone on video record. On the kitchen table, I drafted a final sworn declaration, ownership history attached, deeds, EPA certification copy, time-stamped photos, and my explicit intent to activate the emergency relief system solely to halt unlawful encroachment and protect certified infrastructure. At the bottom, effective 12:01 a.m., Monday. Full responsibility assumed by landowner. No further warnings issued. I emailed it to Colfax, who responded almost immediately. Received. This strengthens your position. Do not damage their equipment. Only activate your own registered system. Video everything. I set my alarm for 11:30 p.m. At 9:47 p.m., my phone lit up with an unknown number. I let it ring twice before answering. Mr. Harlan. Carla's voice was clipped-edged with something new strain. We received your latest correspondence. Good, I said. You lack authority to do what you're threatening. Any interference with operational infrastructure will be treated as criminal sabotage. You constructed operational infrastructure on private land without permission, I replied evenly. You ignored multiple cease and desist orders. You posted threatening signs on my property. And now you accuse me of sabotage. You're being irrational, she snapped. You cannot comprehend the fallout from disrupting a utility that supports essential neighborhood services. I comprehend fallout perfectly, I said. You have until midnight to clear every piece of equipment from Harlan property. A long pause. Muffled voices in the background, someone covering the mouthpiece, urgent whispers. Then her tone shifted colder than I'd ever heard it. You don't set the terms here. The board has voted. The plant is live. Proceed and we will pursue immediate injunctions and damages. I glanced at the wall clock, 9:53. This is your last chance, I said quietly. She gave a short, incredulous laugh. You won't do it. You're too rule-bound, too cautious. The line went dead. I set the phone down, slipped on my jacket, picked up the crank handle. Outside, moonlight silvered the lake's surface, placid, almost reverent. The distant green LED on the barge glowed steadily. Their smart grid had passed final testing. The plant was fully operational. They believed they had won. They had no idea the ground beneath them was about to shift. I walked down the path one last time before midnight boots, silent on pine needles, the weight of legacy steady in my hand. The lake waited. And for the first time in months, it waited only for me. Midnight arrived without fanfare, no thunder, no dramatic wind, just the quiet tick of the kitchen clock and the distant steady hum of the HOA's generators across the water. I was already outside, boots, lace jacket zipped against the cool December air that would soon become irrelevant. The iron crank rested against my leg like an old comrade. My phone was set to record video timestamp, glowing clearly in the dark. I walked the familiar path to the boathouse one last time, flashlight beam cutting a narrow path through the pines. At 11:30 p.m., I lifted the concrete hatch covering the hidden spillway access. The bolts resisted only briefly before yielding with a low metallic sigh. Damp earth and old iron scented the air as I descended the steps. I positioned the phone on a ledge lens aimed at the valve assembly. The brass placard and the crank slot, every detail captured in crisp, time-stamped clarity. I narrated in a calm, deliberate voice my name, Jake Harlan, my undisputed ownership of the lake, and its infrastructure. The ongoing trespass, despite repeated legal notices. My intent to activate the registered emergency release valve solely to protect private property and federally certified runoff systems. No anger, no gloating, just facts spoken for the record. At 11:58 p.m., the phone buzzed again. Another text from HOA Legal. Cease all actions immediately. Final notice. I ignored it. At 11:59, I slid the crank handle into the gearbox. It seated perfectly metal kissing metal with a soft, decisive click. Midnight. I braced my boot against the concrete wall and began to turn slow quarter revolutions, feeling the resistance of decades give way. The valve protested with a deep subterranean groan, then settled into a reluctant rhythm. A faint vibration traveled up the handle into my arms. Water somewhere far below began to move. Nothing spectacular happened on the surface yet. No roar, no geyser. Just the quiet obedience of physics. I climbed back up at 12:07, sealed the hatch loosely so I could return if needed, and walked to the water's edge. The lake still looked serene under moonlight, but I knew better. Beneath that glassy calm, thousands of gallons were already slipping away through channels my father had engineered with slide rules and stubborn foresight. Gravity patient, impartial, unstoppable, was doing its work. By 12:20, the first visible change appeared. The shoreline had retreated a full foot, exposing a dark ribbon of mud that glistened like wet obsidian. Then, 2 feet. The dock's pilings stood slightly taller water, no longer kissing their barnacled bases. Across the lake, the barge lights flickered once, twice. A slow smile spread across my face, the first genuine one in months. At 12:31, my phone rang. Unknown number. I answered. Mr. Harlan, a younger voice, frantic male. This is Lead Engineer Matthews with GreenSpark. We're registering a sudden unexplained drop in head pressure. The system's destabilizing fast. Have you observed any upstream diversion or... Yes, I said quietly. I have initiated one. You should evacuate the platform immediately. Sir, you can't. You have perhaps 10 minutes before footing becomes unsafe, I continued. After that, I can't guarantee stability. I ended the call. By 12:45, the water had fallen nearly 4 feet. The barge listed noticeably, to starboard its scaffolding creaking. Men scrambled across the deck, flashlights stabbing the darkness, voices rising in confusion and alarm. The smart grid housing emitted a shrill warning tone, then fell silent as power failed. In that instant, the entire microhydro plant died. No explosion, no flames. Just abrupt total darkness swallowing their triumph. I stood on the receding shore, moonlight silvering the exposed lake bed, and felt an immense weight slide from my shoulders. This wasn't destruction, it was reclamation. A boundary redrawn not with words or lawyers, but with the simplest force on earth. At 12:58, I returned briefly to the valve, gave the crank one final measured turn to lock the flow at the engineered rate, then secured the hatch fully. As I walked back toward the house, the first blocks of West Bend plunged into blackness, streetlights winking out in sequence, porch lights fading like breath on cold glass. By morning, they would scramble, point fingers, demand answers. But tonight, the lake belonged to me again, and it was speaking in a voice older than any covenant or contract, steady, relentless, and finally heard. The unraveling began in earnest just after 1 a.m. My phone started vibrating relentlessly. Unknown numbers, half-formed voicemails lost to static texts stacking like frantic pleas. What happened to the power? My freezer's thawing. HOA said the new plant would prevent outages. I silenced it and stepped onto the deck with a fresh mug of coffee gone cold in my grip. The moonlight painted the retreating shoreline in silver and shadow, the waterline pulling back like a slow exhale. The dock now stood on stilts of mud, its pilings exposed for the first time since my father drove them in 1976. The air carried the rich, loamy scent of disturbed lakebed algae, decaying leaves, ancient silt rising like a memory unearthed. Across the water, the smart grid failed completely at 1:30. Street lamps winked out in waves block by block, until whole sections of West Bend lay in abrupt darkness. The clubhouse, its proud new motion sensors and security cameras, now useless, sat as a black silhouette against the stars. Backup generators coughed to life briefly, then sputtered into silence, starved of the flow they had never imagined could vanish. They had wagered everything on one arrogant assumption, that the lake would always be there, obedient and endless. At 1:43, I watched a worker lose his footing on the tilting barge. He slid into the ankle-deep sludge with a splash and a curse flashlight spinning across the deck. Panic spread visibly, men shouting coordinates, hauling tools toward higher corners, beams of light slicing wildly through the night. The once proud platform had become a stranded raft grounded on mud that sucked greedily at boots and equipment. By 2:15, the lake had dropped past its midline, revealing a vast crescent of cracked, steaming earth. Old treasures emerged like ghosts, rusted lures glinting in the moonlight, a child's long-lost toy boat half buried in silt, the skeletal remains of a dock my father had dismantled decades ago. I walked the exposed bed with my flashlight boots sinking into cool, viscous mud, recording every foot of retreat on video. At the western edge, the barge sagged deeper, one corner, mired fast. Two Green Spark engineers argued heatedly on the listing deck, one jabbing at a dead tablet, the other sweeping his light toward my shoreline, as if searching for an explanation in the dark. Inside the control housing, water sloshed audibly, where the intake pipe had crumpled under sudden loss of buoyancy. Then headlights swept the access road, a black SUV tearing down the gravel, braking hard enough to spray stones. Carla emerged in heels that sank instantly into the muck. She retreated with a hiss of frustration, trenchcoat flapping as she stormed to firmer ground. Even from my vantage in the tree line, I could see her face flushed with fury beneath the floodlights. She seized a tablet from an engineer, stared at plummeting pressure readings, then hurled it into the mud with a splintering crack. Her shouts carried across the widening gap, sharp commands, accusations, demands for someone to fix this now. She turned toward my house lights, the only ones still burning steadily on the ridge, and stood motionless for a long moment, chest heaving. I half expected her to scream my name into the night, but I stayed hidden in the shadows. She had forfeited any right to confrontation. At 2:30, the first official vehicle arrived, a county utility truck with a yellow beacon rotating slowly. Two men in city windbreakers stepped out, clipboards ready. One was Rudy Delgado, an old Corps buddy who'd moved into flood response work. He spotted me almost immediately as I emerged from the trees. "Jake Harlan," he said, shaking his head with something between disbelief and admiration. "You really did it." "Evening, Rudy." Just watching the water find its own level. He surveyed the half-empty basin, the stranded barge, Carla pacing like a general whose battle plan had dissolved. "Got your complaint folder from last week. Didn't think you'd pull the pin." I handed him the fresh packet deed, EPA certification, time-stamped valve, photos, my notarized declaration. He flipped through it under his flashlight. Catchment 43B still active. No flow cap breach. This is airtight, brother. Behind us, Carla's voice cut through the night. "That man sabotaged public infrastructure. He's endangering the entire community. I want him arrested." Rudy didn't turn. He simply closed the folder and spoke loud enough for her to hear. "This isn't public infrastructure, ma'am. It's built on private property, partially inside a federally protected runoff corridor. The sabotage charge doesn't stick when the landowner activates his own registered emergency system." Carla's mouth opened, closed, opened again. No sound emerged. The control housing groaned, louder metal protesting as it settled deeper into the lake bed. A final defeated sigh from a machine that had never been welcome. By 3 a.m., the site was cordoned with yellow caution tape. City crews documented the scene, while Carla stood beneath a borrowed umbrella phone glued to her ear, voice cracking as she argued with unseen lawyers. I remained beside the empty dock, fingers tracing the weathered wood my father had planed smooth with his own hands. The lake was no longer full, but for the first time in months, it was entirely, undeniably mine again. And the night air felt cleaner, freed of humming generators and false promises as gravity finished the conversation the HOA had refused to have. Dawn broke cold and revealing. I woke to shouts echoing across the hollowed basin, distant at first, then sharper, carried on frost-tinged air. Coffee in hand, I stepped onto the deck and surveyed what remained of the lake, a wide, dark bowl stabilized exactly at my father's engineered low-water mark. No flooding downstream, no erosion scars, just exposed earth breathing freely for the first time in generations. Across the ridge, West Bend was unraveling. Traffic lights hung dead at intersections, cars idling in confused clusters. The clubhouse doors bore frantic handwritten notices. "Power outage. Generators failed. Stay calm." My phone finally unmuted, showed dozens of missed calls and a flooded community app. Screenshots poured in from neighbors. Anyone know why the new backup plant killed our power instead of saving it? Fridge is dead. Lost hundreds in groceries. HOA promised no more outages. What the hell? At 7:22 a.m., the first news van arrived, satellite mast rising like a periscope. A cameraman panned slowly across the stranded barge, now a pathetic island of twisted metal and caution tape, while the reporter rehearsed breathless lines about mysterious overnight drainage and neighborhood in crisis. Carla appeared just after 8, emerging from the HOA office, flanked by 2 remaining board members. She looked diminished, blazer-wrinkled hair pulled back severely, voice fraying as residents surrounded her with questions that had turned hostile overnight. "You told us this was permitted," one man shouted. "My basement sump failed. No power," a woman added. Carla raised her hands, pleading for quiet, but the crowd pressed closer, phones recording every stumble. I stayed on my ridge, watching from a distance. I didn't need to be in the fray. The lake had spoken for me. By 9:30, 2 more agencies descended. Environmental compliance inspectors in marked SUVs picked their way across the mudflats, photographing collapsed piping and the tilted turbine housing. Municipal risk management officials followed, clipboards thick with violation forms. Then came the arrival Carla had dreaded most, the EPA. A white Suburban with federal plates pulled in shortly before 10, followed by 2 field agents in olive jackets. Inspector Levin, the silver-haired woman who had once dismissed my complaint, stepped out first. She surveyed the scene in silence, then walked directly toward me as I stood near the caution tape. "Mr. Harlan." "Inspector." She studied the exposed lakebed, the barge listing like a shipwreck, the furious cluster around Carla. "We received multiple urgent reports overnight," she said. "Unauthorized diversion, potential Clean Water Act breaches." I handed her the folder I'd prepared for this exact moment, same contents I'd given Rudy now, with added overnight photos and flow rate logs. She read for several minutes, expression unreadable. "You executed the release personally?" "Yes, ma'am. Within certified parameters. No downstream impact." She nodded once slowly. "You're not the focus of this investigation." Across the basin, Carla's voice rose in protest as a second EPA agent pointed at the crumpled intake and shook his head. Drone cameras overhead caught it all, her gestures growing wilder, officials' calm refusal to engage. By noon, the verdict was official. West Bend Energy Initiative declared non-operational and non-compliant. Stop work order issued. Full environmental review pending. The backlash was swift and merciless. Emergency HOA bulletins tried desperately to spin temporary setback, unforeseen geological event, external factors. But trust had evaporated. Residents who'd once cheered ribbon cuttings now demanded audits, refunds on special assessments, even recalls. Neighbors I hadn't spoken to in months began approaching my driveway, hesitant at first, then earnest. One brought a plate of cookies and an apology muttered with downcast eyes. A woman I recognized from the Facebook photos teared up on my porch. "I didn't know it was truly yours," she said. "They kept saying community resource. I feel sick." I accepted their words, not for absolution. They weren't the ones who needed it, but because carrying resentment felt suddenly heavier than letting it go. At 2:15 p.m., Colfax called. "It's over," he said, unable to hide satisfaction. "City just issued formal acknowledgement of your sole ownership. Greenbelt overlay retracted permanently. EPA's review is aimed squarely at the HOA and GreenSpark, and Council reached out, settlement terms incoming." I exhaled, shoulders loosening for the first time in months. That evening, Carla's resignation landed in inboxes, terse, clinical, citing personal reasons and wishing the community well. No apology. No explanation. But the subtext was clear: she had become the liability. Social media clips of her arguing with inspectors looped endlessly, comments brutal. Local news ran side-by-side footage, triumphant ribbon cutting one week, stranded barge the next. As sunset painted the exposed lakebed in bruised purples and golds, I walked its edge one more time. The mud had begun to firm underfoot, cracks webbing across the surface like veins. The stranded turbine caught the last light fins, bent and silent. I knelt, pressed my hand into the cool earth, and felt the faint thrum of water, still moving far below, patient, waiting for my signal to return. The HOA had tried to erase my boundary. Instead, they had exposed their own fragility. And tomorrow, when the cranes arrived to remove their folly piece by piece, the lake would begin healing, quietly, on its own terms, just as my father had always intended. 3 weeks later, the last traces of their arrogance were hauled away. I watched from the porch as a convoy of flatbed trailers and a massive crane rumbled down the access road. 6 men in hard hats worked methodically under a pale winter sun, cutting cables, dismantling scaffolding, and lifting the ruined turbine section by section. The once gleaming fins, now bent and caked with dried mud, swung overhead like defeated banners before being lowered onto waiting trucks. The smart grid housing came last, a hollow fiberglass shell circuits drowned and dead-loaded unceremoniously amid the clank of chains and the low growl of diesel engines. There was no fanfare, no press conference, just the quiet, methodical retreat of a project that had overreached and paid the price. The HOA board lay in tatters. Carla had vanished from public view, rumors whispered of private attorneys and potential countersuits against the very board she'd once commanded. Several of her staunchest allies resigned quietly, citing family obligations or health concerns. Emergency elections were announced, but attendance was sparse. Trust once shattered doesn't mend overnight. The community's mood had shifted entirely. Where once I'd been the silent holdout, I now received nods, waves, even grateful smiles from neighbors who'd spent months avoiding my gaze. Some stopped by with quiet offerings, fresh-baked bread, a bottle of bourbon, a handwritten note of apology. I accepted them graciously. The anger had served its purpose. Now it felt lighter to release. The media lingered a little longer. A national veterans blog picked up the local segment, framing it as one man's stand against bureaucratic overreach. Letters arrived from strangers across the country, homeowners battling their own HOAs, families who'd lost ponds or woodlands to community progress. They thanked me, asked for advice, shared their own stories of quiet defeats. I replied when I could, keeping it simple: document everything. Know your land. Stand firm. Colfax called near month's end with the final details. Settlements signed, he said. Cities issuing a permanent retraction of any greenbelt claim over your lake. All future maps will reflect sole Harlan ownership. HOA admits trespass in the consent judgment, removes every sign, and covers full damages plus legal fees. Enough to fix anything they broke. He laughed. Enough to build a new dock twice over with interest. I thanked him and hung up the victory, settling not as triumph, but as simple restoration, like water finding its old level after a storm. That afternoon, I returned to the concealed spillway access one last time. With a long wrench, I slowly reopened the secondary intake valves. A deep, resonant gurgle rose from below as fresh inflow began, groundwater and seasonal runoff trickling back into the basin. It would take weeks, perhaps months, for the lake to refill completely, but time was no longer my enemy. While the water crept upward, inch by patient inch, I reinforced the hatch, new stainless bolts. Then a custom-welded steel plate etched with clear warning. Private lake, federally certified infrastructure. Trespass subject to prosecution. And beneath, in smaller, deliberate letters, but you are not entitled to what you do not own. That evening, I sat on the shore with Bear and Murphy sprawled at my feet, the sky bleeding from orange to deep indigo. The surface mirrored the first stars unbroken, except for the gentle ripples of returning water. No generators hummed. No floodlights glared. Just the soft lap against emerging pilings and the occasional splash of a bass reclaiming its territory. I thought of my father, James Harlan, standing in this same spot half a century ago, arms crossed, surveying the fruits of his labor. He'd built not just a lake, but a fortress of foresight systems within systems, protections layered like armor. He'd taught me that real ownership isn't paper or possession, it's stewardship. Defending what matters even when no one else will. And I thought of Carla, of that final night, her silhouette against failing light's voice, cracking as her carefully constructed world tilted and sank. Power, I realized, doesn't reside in titles, or votes, or glossy renderings. It lives in roots deep enough to withstand the pull of those who believe they can redraw boundaries at will. The lake was quiet now, healing, whole. Water had returned home, carrying away the debris of overreach and leaving only clarity in its wake. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply settles steady, inevitable, and true as the surface stills and reflects only what has always belonged there. My father's lake. My lake. Ours again.